It's Kaína. I work at the St. Jamestown Community Corner, not center.
Sorry,
um,
community corner. My apologies, everyone.
no, don't apologize. So I am the 2S LGBTQ coordinator here. Part of that is right now very focused on like the pandemic response and the vaccine engagement strategy. But we also host like a wide variety of programs. We have like a queer newcomers kitchen. We have like queer newcomers workshops. In fact, we have one today at the corner. And we also have like 2S LGBTQ movie night where we show like different queer films from around the world each week. And we also do a lot of like outreach and engagement in the village and the downtown east specifically, but we also go out to the West End too, and wherever we're kind of needed, including sometimes, well, as of this month, we'll be starting to work in school settings as well. I actually started my kind of, journey here in the sector through volunteering. I don't have any specific social work educational background. I haven't completed my degree yet. My degree is supposed to be in religion and urban studies, but I have not yet actually finished it. But because I live in St. Jamestown, I had an opportunity to volunteer with the corner and kind of get to be more deeply involved in the community, and that kind of started my trajectory. So also, like, I do want to acknowledge that like how important lived experience is, and like how to recognize it, since most agencies and most organizations, I would say, often pay kind of lip service to lived experience and actually don't really understand how to utilize it in a way that can actually benefit community, and often focus far too much on educational credentials. With that being said, I'll pull up my PowerPoint now, and then I'll reintroduce myself personally and professionally to show a little bit about my life story and trajectory. So give me a second. Oh, screen sharing is disabled.
My apologies. One second.
No stress. Okay. Dame un momento. Okay. This is like a very bare bones presentation. Sorry, guys, I'm not a, a graphic designer. So today we're going to talk mostly about lived experience in the social work sector, specifically as it pertains to both setting boundaries and understanding power dynamics. From what I understand, like a lot of the folks joining today are youth workers. So like the experience that I'm coming from, like I'm not a youth worker. I work with queer communities, including a lot of queer youth, but that's not my only specialty. So some of this might be applicable, but it's probably applicable when, changed to your own context. So I don't want to say that this is like should be taken as a blanket statement or a blanket lesson, and actually we'll be discussing that about how everybody has their own kind of version of what they're comfortable with, and how they work, and we're trying to basically come to an understanding here of how to communicate that to stakeholders in the community and in your organization, so that you can continue to be empowered to do work that you do. So again, here's a little introduction with some photos of me. So I was born in 1999 to a Venezuelan father and a Dutch mother. my childhood was split between Boston and Montreal. And I spent a lot of time like with my aunt and with my grandmothers. I had a very kind of like sporadic relationship with my parents because they were often working. So it was my grandparents and my aunt that took care of a lot of the day-to-day kind of well-being of my childhood. I moved to Ottawa when my mother remarried somebody when I was a teenager, and I faced a lot of like abuse in Ottawa, specifically like homophobic and sexual abuse. So I moved to Toronto in 2017 so that I could live both more authentically towards who I was and more freely. When I moved to Toronto, as you see in the picture, on the far right, like I was, on the top right, like I did move to Toronto pre-transition. So, I definitely had an understanding of my own like sexual orientation and identity to an extent in Ottawa, but living in Toronto definitely like empowered me to come into my transness and to become or evolve into the person that I always felt I was kind of fundamentally. So when I moved to Toronto in 2017, though I was much happier in terms of like the friendships that I could create, the safety that I felt in like day-to-day living, the ability to explore different cultural, gender, sexual expressions with people who had my well-being in mind. It did come at a great cost, and that Toronto is unfortunately also kind of stuck in this vicious capitalist cycle in which rent is extremely unaffordable. Employment opportunities are scarce, classism is rampant, racism is rampant, and unfortunately, like I felt that I was a victim of all those things, right? As a child of immigrants, as someone who speaks English as their third language and doesn't always have a constant frequent ability to speak it fluently. As somebody who was queer, and as somebody who was young as well, I spent most of my first 5 years in Toronto, or first 4 years, I guess, because I've been here for 6, very precariously housed, and in a lot of just cycles of pain and frustration and moving around. I moved 13 times in my first 3 years in Toronto, and that doesn't include all the times that I crashed at people's couches, that I used money to pay out of pocket to find an Airbnb. And part of it was to do with the cycle of, in the industry that I worked at the time, which was entertainment, which I know a lot of youth, since you guys are youth workers, a lot of youth want to get into entertainment and expressive and creative arts. But the aspects of that industry are extremely oppressive still, in terms of what they deem acceptable oppression in certain spaces. So even though you do have people in the entertainment industry, like models, actors, singers, etc., who are trans and who are out, there are other sections of the industry, especially people who work behind the scenes, who will not get jobs because they are trans. And basically, like what I always told was, you can never outshine the client. So don't wear nice makeup, don't wear skirts, don't do anything that makes you look girly, don't bother with transitioning. You can be a gay man because that was normal in PR, and that was about as far as it would go, right? So I often had to take contracts that were not very well paying, because I kind of had to take whatever I could get, and whoever would accept me. So I often was on various precarious work contracts, and thus no landlord wanted me because they didn't know where I was getting my next month of income from. So this was this like vicious cycle of like housing, employment, and how oppression plays into it, until I was able to get an apartment through somebody in St. Jamestown. And that's where I live until today. That's where you'd have to drag me out, kicking and screaming and probably dead. Because now I've actually like made this place my home. I fall in love with the neighborhood. I've accumulated a lot of stuff in my house, I realized. And I'm this neighborhood actually was really, really important and critical to have me start on my own life trajectory in the social work sector. So now I'm gonna switch the slide to talk about my professional experience. So I started in March of 2021, right when there was a lot of stuff going on with the pandemic, when things were really bad. And the vaccine had just been released and was starting to roll out into certain populations and communities. So I started volunteering at the St. Jamestown Community Corner, which is a local social services organization that serves folks in the downtown east, just as a volunteer, because my interest was specifically focused around vaccine equity. And I had forgotten to mention this in my personal part, even though I wrote it down. Like, I had been very involved in like social movements that were both back in Latin America, where I'm from, and here in Toronto, especially like Indigenous sovereignty and racial justice related movements. I've worked with like Surge and like Youth for Wet'suwet'en groups and that kind of stuff. And I was looking and kind of monitoring the vaccine equity situation and how folks in St. Jamestown were struggling to access the vaccine. And that kind of coincided with the coroner doing that same kind of work and figuring out how to increase access. So we actually worked together and then mounted a bunch of pop-up clinics. And we literally knocked on like every single door in the neighborhood. I have knocked on every single door in this neighborhood, all 19 buildings, every floor, and had conversations with community members and tried to identify what their access needs were in order to help them get their COVID-19 vaccine. After this, this was completely on a volunteer basis. This I was doing just because I was a personal stakeholder in the neighborhood who wanted to see equity expanded. And in the summer, around June, the corner did offer me a paid opportunity to continue the work as a community ambassador, as a vaccine ambassador. I did that right into January on what felt like nearly full-time hours. I was juggling school with it. It was a struggle. But, you know, we pulled ahead, and I think between the WCC, all our pop-up clinics, and the Region Park 40 Oak site, I think we administered something like 55,000 vaccines. So we really were able to increase the vaccine access in the community. There's even a video of me floating on YouTube from CBC The National about me going to the subway stations at 4 in the morning, where the Spanish-speaking construction workers were coming in and telling them, you know, you can get your vaccine. We have late night pop-up clinics. You'll see a picture here of me in the middle of the night outside in the grass. That's at a late night pop-up clinic. And we used to host these clinics till 1 in the morning. So those who you know, were in oppressive and precarious work situations and often had to work late into the night could still get their COVID-19 vaccine. On January 31st of 2022, we had found funding for me to work as a full-time outreach worker. So that is when my portfolio started to expand a little bit to include working on seniors programs for seniors who didn't speak English and like make language-specific seniors programs, and an LGBTQ newcomers drop-in. And the latter one, this LGBTQ newcomers drop-in and LGBTQ community engagement in general, this was like uncharted territory for TNO and to a lesser extent for the corner. I mean, nobody knew what they were doing, and I was like the one queer staff member, and it was like I had a room and I was using my own like wages to pay for the pizza out of pocket, and it literally started like on the ground like this. But you know, we're 10 minutes away from the village, and you know, when the village got gentrified, a lot of queer people of color, a lot of queer disabled community members had to come here if they wanted to remain close to the services, like the medical and health services that were available in the village. So we have, you know, a very large LGBTQ community here. It's very present. It's very visible, but it is a community that often the community members are here because they either face displacement where they were from, they're newcomers starting their life completely fresh, or they face disability and chronic health issues that require ongoing support. So it's not community members that you see in the clubs, it's not community members with a lot of economic and social mobility. So we're basically working from the framework of, instead of keeping referring them to services in the village or programs in the village, some of them can't even walk over there. So let's actually do something that allows them to be empowered in the neighborhood that they actually live in, so that they actually feel a sense of ownership and a sense of belonging in this neighborhood. And that has expanded now to become such a big project. Now I'm a coordinator. We have the 2S LGBTQ citywide pandemic response and vaccine engagement strategy, which is taking place. And so that means that I'm starting to connect with other agencies, not just in St. Jamestown, but in places like Rexdale and places like Thorncliffe, Crescent Town. And we're learning about the experiences of queer community members who are in the closet, who are in oppressive environments. Most of them, especially in the neighborhoods that I mentioned, are youth as well. And we kind of work on a combination of programs and drop-ins that are actually accessible for them, that they can access safely, and actually direct delivery of services. Okay, that's enough of me talking. Well, for the start, I'll keep talking later. But I wanted to see if it was possible to sort of do a kind of go around with everybody where folks can introduce themselves. That can be either in the chat, or if you want to speak up, I would love if you spoke up. But what I want to know is, to start, like, who are you? Where do you work? And what are your aspirations when working in this field? What are you seeking to achieve? I don't want to be mean and call anybody out or volunteer anybody. So feel free to just kind of unmute yourselves and speak up.
I can start. My name is Dalreen. I work at TFLIP with Nadia as well. I'm the new anti-racism community coordinator. So I just moved back from a country where it's very open, but at the same time, there's sort of like people tend to be politically incorrect. So I'm interested in knowing how to learn how to be politically correct again. Because, sometimes I don't want to offend anybody, but with my ignorance, I might offend somebody.
Nobody else wants to share? Thank you for sharing, Darien. Maybe folks will be more interested in sharing into the next question so that they don't kind of have to expose themselves. But what I want to know as well, because this is something that is very personal to me in terms of how I do this work, is how does your positionality, so that's like your life experiences, your current privileges or disadvantages, who you are intrinsically, how does that drive your passion? So how does your positionality drive your passion? Does anybody want to speak up on that?
I could go. Hi, everyone. My name is Rosie. I work as a child and youth counselor at the Canadian Center for Victims of Torture. It's a long one, CCVT. And what are my aspirations in this field? Or I'll probably just go straight to the question you asked at the end just now. How do I start? I initially, growing up, I wanted to actually just go into business and administration and stuff like that. But then along the journey, I found myself studying psychology, sociology, and African studies. And then ultimately it led me to, working at CCBT as a youth mentorship facilitator, because I had experience working as a mentor before. And so, but I think my journey to Canada itself shaped where I am today, because like yourself, okay, I don't know, I'm not sure if I read at the beginning correctly, but like I came here at 17 as a separated youth. So my own experience was, staying in a shelter, meeting different people from all across the world, learning to sort of adapt to a new society and a new culture, and a whole lot of stuff that was new to me, because I mean, where I'm from the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's not so, how do I say it, multicultural, and so I think what led me to where I am today is through my experience as a separated youth into Canada. I was able to sort of find my passion and my drive to serve youth who are in the position that I was in, trying to find somebody to talk to, somebody that you can relate with. And I really, I don't know if I should say admire what I've gone through, or like I appreciate, let me use the word appreciate, because of that experience, I'm able to do the job I'm doing today. Because how else do you work with youth and children when you yourself don't have an overall, I mean, apart from school and overtime experience, I had that personal journey that I had an experience that allowed me to be able to work in the position that I'm in. So that's how I ended up where I am, and it's what drives me. It's what makes me want to see other youth and other children moving forward, because I had people like that, counselors and mentors around me, that sort of just pushed and encouraged. And so that's why I'm in the position today to do the same thing and to give back, and yeah, I hope I answered the question.
Totally. That was a great, I don't want to say story because it's lived experience too, but that was a really important sharing and teaching. So thank you so much. Did that maybe inspire anybody else to kind of answer the question about how does one's positionality drive their passion?
We have a response in the chat. I can read it. Hello, my name is Amal, and I'm a program coordinator, RAP Resettlement, Polycultural Immigration, Immigrant and Community Services. I'm passionate about serving newcomers, and I'm adjusting my positionality towards more understanding and inclusive service, and to give more voice to youth and help to express themselves in the way they feel comfortable with.
Sorry, I was trying to click on mute and then it just threw me into the next slide. So I assume by the sounds no one else has anything to share. But we'll have another discussion, I think, closer to the end. So one thing is like,
kindly requested to send us the same document.
oh, is someone saying something? Okay. Okay. So when we talk about like doing work, and especially like work that taps into one's kind of lived experience, I would say that I work at an organization that is both place-based and community rooted. So I work at a place-based organization, actually, like we serve people in St. Jamestown, regardless of where they're from, but the common theme is they all live in St. Jamestown. So that is like a community center, a neighborhood group, maybe in the case of like, especially in the downtown east, like shelters that are kind of like close to sites where there are encampments and stuff like that. And then you also have like community-rooted organizations that specialize in working with a vulnerable population or a vulnerable sector. So like one organization I can think of off the top of my head is like Friends of Ruby, right? Because they work specifically in like queer youth, and they have queer youth drop-ins, and they have a transitional home for queer youth. But like, you know, even Friends of Ruby, like they have a pretty strict policy on like, you know, you have to have lived experience to work in this organization. So you have to be LGBTQ identified. And they also do try and work with some of the youth who kind of have aged out of programming, and see how they can like continue to support in a volunteer capacity or in a staff capacity after that to support the new crop of youth who come in. And in my case, like my specific job is to work with a vulnerable population within a community. So I'm working both at a place-based organization where I'm an employee, but I'm also like a local stakeholder because I'm a resident of St. Jamestown. And then I am an outreach worker or community worker with US LGBTQ populations, but I am also a member of the community, so that also makes me a stakeholder, right? So like if I leave St. Jamestown Community Corner, I might still go back to access services or programming just as a resident or just as a community member who needs access to those services. And, you know, with a lot of folks who work in these community-rooted organizations or who start connecting with agencies that serve specific population groups, sometimes that work or that job is actually not the start of your relationship with that agency. It's actually kind of more like the end, or like the kind of finish line of the trajectory that you went on. You might have started by attending a drop-in or being a peer mentor or accessing a service, and then starting to connect with different realms of this organization or with different stakeholders who, you know, kind of saw an opportunity for you to volunteer. And then once you volunteered and you did this work, or once you attended the drop-in, you kind of shined in that space, then they also followed up by offering a position or an opportunity to continue your work and to basically leverage your passion to help advance their work. So, you know, it's important, like when you're kind of in that space, your trajectory or how you start is going to end up being very different than people who have a background exclusively in the educational field of social work, right? So people who are trained to be social workers, community workers, crisis response workers, who have gone to school, did like a student placement, then applied for jobs through like the conventional method, and then landed where they land. You know, if they're working in a neighborhood organization, like I see this all the time at the corner, the first couple of weeks or even months is just spending time getting oriented to like what this neighborhood is, who the residents of these neighborhood are, understanding all the power dynamics and the positions of everybody who's there, and the politics of the neighborhood too. So much time is like, that's the orientation that actually is much longer than the conventional orientation of like, fill out your documents for HR. Here's like a, you know, anti-oppression, anti-racism manual kind of thing. That's like a very short orientation period, but the longer orientation period is starting to understand where you are. And people who start working because a supervisor, because a manager, because a program is tapping into people's lived experience, don't have that orientation period. So they do actually hold this really important advantage, but they also often have a disadvantage in that, you know, if you're going to access a certain services or programs, it's often because you're economically or socially marginalized or disadvantaged in some sort of way by the system. So you probably don't have the level of experience in the educational field to be able to understand how to clearly establish boundaries, or to be able to really discern the centers of power in your organization. And that can often get you in trouble. That's gotten me in trouble a lot of times. So that is where you need to actually figure out whether that's on your own time, now that you have time to breathe, now that you have a job, now that you're kind of working in this field, how you can kind of settle in and also learn the theoretical aspects, and then learn who you are when you're doing this work. And that means starting to learn what your boundaries are, what you're comfortable with, and what your connection to community is going to be in this new position. And when doing that, it's really important to understand where the power dynamics and where the centers of power are, in my opinion. Because and this is purely speaking to my experience especially, but I think that it will be relatable to some folks. You often face power dynamics from above and then from below. So the power dynamics, or the power structures or centers that you face from above, are often the oppressive nature of the nonprofit sector, because the nonprofit sector is oppressive, and does not do always, or does not achieve the work that it says that it intends to do, because of policies, and because also the way that it's structured in a capitalist society, in a society that's become increasingly anti-welfare and anti-well-being, right? And you especially start to feel that when you're working as a minority person in a setting that has another majority. So like I work for TNO, I work at the corner. The staff is predominantly, South Asian parents and South Asian community members. And they understand that community in ways that I will never understand. And they understand the experience of immigrating and navigating that process in ways that I don't understand, because I came here as a kid. My parents took care of our whole immigration process. So they have a knowledge that I could definitely learn from. But I'm also then a minority person, and my supervisor is going to be somebody without my lived experience. But they will be responsible for basically allowing me or not allowing me to do the work in the way that I think best serves the community. And this can create really, really like a pretty toxic hamster wheel, like I would call it, where you feel like you're just running in circles because you're not being empowered to do the work in the way that the community needs it, because you're trying to communicate information to somebody who doesn't understand your community, and certainly doesn't understand how to serve that community. And I've seen a lot of burnout stem from that. But what you also have to understand is that there is a power dynamic or power center from below, in which you are somebody else's oppressor, or can be somebody else's oppressor, because of this position that you've been given now as a social worker working with a vulnerable community members. So as a paid employee, you have privileges that others in your community do not have. And that can be good or bad. Like jealousy or other problems, that's a whole other conversation. But in a positive way, you become an access point and lifeline for those in your community who need help. And you start investing a lot of time in your personal time and your work time in becoming that access point. And because you are somebody with the lived experience, you start to go out of your way to help people in your community. That is very normal and expected. But a lot of times you'll fail to meet the standard of those community members, because you start to encounter the oppressive power dynamics from above that start to kind of put up barriers for you. So not just your supervisor, whatever, but also like the healthcare system itself is works at a disadvantage to queer community members. So we like the type of healthcare services that queer folks in my community would like to have just simply don't exist. So I have to come back to them and I have to say these don't exist, or actually I can't help you. And that can be very hurtful. And sometimes it can be interpreted by the community member as an act of violence if it is not communicated clearly that the service doesn't exist, not that you are withholding the service from them. And sometimes they do start to personalize it because they're speaking to not just an employee or social worker, they're also speaking to a peer in terms of lived experience. So it's really important that you understand your positioning and your privilege, so that when boundaries are crossed by people and you wish those boundaries had not been crossed, you at least can understand and empathize why those boundaries are crossed, so that you start to not resent the clients or the community that you are a part of, and so that you can still be in community. But it is really important to understand your positioning there. And it also just helps you even begin to establish boundaries, right? Because if you know where you're located, then you know where you start constructing your borders. So accountability, and when you look at accountability process, your accountability is not just to your community, because we are working in a work environment, and it's oppressive, it's hierarchical, it's overly structured, it's bureaucratic. So you still have to be accountable to your supervisor. So accountability in this instance is like, yes, share information and updates with the supervisor, make sure they become a collaborator in this work. But again, like I said, they often don't understand you. So being accountable to your supervisor also means really sitting down, having a frank conversation with them, and then saying that I will do work, if this is within your capacity, and it will help you and benefit you in the long term, that I will do work to educate you, so that when I'm speaking of a certain scenario or a certain situation that's happening, you at least know the context of where that is coming from. So, a really obvious example for me is like one time my supervisor came to me and said, like, why is the queer community so vicious to one another? Because at the time we had a lot of clients and participants, and they were all fighting each other, and all of them were filing complaints against each other and stuff. And I said, well, you have to understand like this stereotype of like queer people like bringing each other down, or like the crabs in the barrel mentality, which I know is like also a stereotype that is often assigned to like racial minority groups and other communities, as an excuse to sort of be like, oh, well, we shouldn't help these people because they don't even want to help themselves. But of course, what is missing from that is the understanding of trauma and how trauma erupts in people and then causes harms to others. Because trauma, in the case of minoritized groups, in the case of marginalized communities, is a collective experience. It's not an individual experience, which means that trauma is something that's both experienced at the individual level and then is still constantly inflicted onto others, both within the community and from outside the community, creating a kind of collective series of experiences and pain that we all have, or at least can relate to. And it's important to talk with my supervisor about that, make that understanding, because he kind of was like, you guys should be united, you're all the same. And we were actually, like I was saying, like, no, like we're not all the same, right? Like we're not all coming from the same background. But what we do all have is some sort of collective trauma that as a community we have faced, and how people process that and then inflict that onto others looks very different on a case-by-case basis. So like for me, then I do work that's very empathy driven, but I also need to educate my supervisor in a way that's both like, hey, heads up, this is going to happen, or this is why this has already happened. And I think if you should have a supervisor who appreciates that, and wants to know that and be educated. If you have a supervisor who or an organization that's just trying to mount a program but is not listening to you and does not care what you say and is just expecting you to mount this program and single-handedly face all the burden of the challenges and the systemic oppression that the community faces, do not continue to work with this organization, or establish your boundary and say, I am not going to be your queer community worker or your youth worker just because I possess lived experience, because you're also not empowering me to actually do this work moving forward. And then that might be a whole nother conversation, but you do have to stand your ground. Your supervisor needs to support you. And then from the below part, which is the community accountability process, you should remain accountable to your community. You have to do work that is reflective of their needs and what they want. And if you're consistently not meeting the needs of the community, or the community is frustrated by your work collectively, then you do actually should kind of reconsider how you're doing that work. And, don't take it personally, but sometimes we have things that we think are really important and the rest of the community doesn't see it that way. So we need to actually adjust so that we're really hearing from the community that we're serving what they need and then adjusting accordingly and then delivering that. But of course, don't burn yourself out. And don't, become a 2-on-1 line for every single queer person or every single youth or every single racialized person that you work with, because you're not a 2-on-1 line and you're not available 24/7. So it is on you to first establish your boundaries. So again, like I said, like once you can develop your positionality, then you can start to figure out where you are constructing the borders, like the actual position of the borders and according to where you are. And then the second one is going to be determining the level of enforcement that is acceptable and realistic to you. So if you want to be, like, I know one person who works in the queer community who has very, very strict boundaries. They do outreach work, street outreach work, and they work their hours 5 days a week. When they are not working, like the community knows those hours that they work, and when they're not working, do not talk to them, do not look at them, like don't say nothing. If they're with their partner, don't approach them. So that is like a very, very strict boundary. And then there are people like, in my case, like I used to have a client who lived next door to me in the same building in St. Jamestown. So like with that client, I sort of had to be more flexible because like they did know where I live. Inevitably, if they were in crisis, I knew they would knock on my door. Like that's just how it was. And I kind of had to accept that, but I was willing to accept that at that time. That person has since moved on. I haven't seen them lately. But now I'm not willing to accept that. So now actually I have spoken with clients and I have said, like, I'm not your 2-on-1 line. I'm not like your complaints line. That's another thing. People sometimes call just to vent, but don't actually need like a specific service or a specific support other than the venting. And I'm no longer an outreach worker and I'm no longer a peer support worker. So, I have kind of redirected folks and say, there is someone you can vent to, but it's not me. So you're always kind of, as your positionality changes too, you're always sort of reconstructing your boundaries and what is acceptable to you. So it's kind of, like you'll have boundaries in theory, but you do kind of have to have or be vigilant or just have in mind when can they be pushed and how far can they be pushed, because if you're working in the community that you're a part of, it will be pushed. Like that's not even like that's guaranteed. So you need to kind of determine like how far it can be pushed. And then if you think that it can't be pushed very far because of your own personal capacity or whatever valid reason, then you need to develop a plan around that. You need to kind of get your supervisor involved. You need to work with community members and just be frank and realistic, and express that to them from the beginning. So, and I find often that like clients are very understanding. Like, I mean, they are making an expectation out of you, but like often they do still know that you're human. So you have to speak to them like a human about when your capacity changes or when your feelings change. And you need to approach them personally and erect new boundaries. And if they don't understand that, don't internalize that. Don't just leave it to fester so that they resent you or that you resent them. Don't let them continue to break those boundaries. That's when you need to like speak to your supervisor, and kind of say like, you know, this is what's going on. These are the boundaries that I've set. The client isn't respecting that. And this is why it's so important to do constant educational work, because if you never educated your supervisor on the traumas that that person might have, or why you know, these boundaries are being broken, and you just come and say, I don't feel comfortable around this client, then often the organization will be like, you know, something akin to like, oh, let's ban them, or oh, let's prevent them from contacting you ever again, or something like that, which coming from a majoritarian organization to someone who's from a marginalized, minoritized group, can be seen as an act of violence, and that basically you used your privilege and your position within the organization to ban them from what was a safe space for them. So it's a really important balancing act. And that's why, you know, you're going to have good relationships with your clients if you have lived experience. So be firm about your boundaries, you know, erect them, but also communicate that constantly to the clients, and also be in constant communication with your supervisor, so that when boundaries are broken in ways that are uncomfortable to you, in ways that are violent to you, in ways that are harassing you, that the organization is also equipped with the tools to deal with that, and doesn't go for the nuclear option that ends up hurting your community. So that is like enough of me speaking, I think. I want to kind of go into more like a discussion phase. So I would love to know from people in this audience, in this group, have there been examples in your work where you have felt bounded or oppressed by power dynamics around you? Has that, you know, constrained you from achieving your active service to the community? What were the causes? You know, that kind of thing. Does anybody have anything that they want to say around that? If you want, you could also answer the second question, which is much simpler. How does your lived experience affect how you work? Does anybody want to speak up on that?
I can share that when I was on the front line, I remember going to this community event on a Sunday. And it turns out that there maybe were quite a few people who I knew personally through work, like service users. And I just remember sitting there and people actually formed a line with requests that they were going to need or follow up in like the week ahead. And as much as I wanted to help or like remember it, I just remember feeling so resentful because like this was my day off and I was here like to enjoy this event. And almost like resentful or mad that these folks would like think to ask on a Sunday. But I also like remember these are dynamics that I potentially set up because I didn't have great boundaries in my work. That was something I really struggled with. If someone called after hours, or I found myself checking emails on the weekend, and if you respond, of course, it sets the expectation that you're going to continue to respond beyond your 9 to 5. So I felt like the resentment and like the burnout that I was getting from just having like this being overstretched, a lot to do with my own poor boundary setting, was something that really stopped me from like continuing to work in the community. It made it not like something that I felt like I could do in the long term.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And that happens so often, and that's why I said, like, that's the relationship with both the supervisor and the community is really critical there, because the supervisor can, like, a good supervisor is also a mentor, right? And a bad supervisor is just like a micromanager kind of position, right?
Agreed.
So, but when you have somebody who's actually willing to mentor you, and they might also have lived experience, that there's a lot of relatability there, and they can kind of help you work through that. And then when you have the community accountability process that you set up with your clients who know that you're also a peer because you have the same lived experience, then you can also work through with the community on saying, like, actually I'm spending time away, or I'm pulling back because this is hard for me, sort of thing, right? And they often do find that the community is responsive. We might, because we see them as, vulnerable or disadvantaged clients, desperate clients, clients in crisis or whatever. Some of them, won't listen to us when we set up those boundaries, but a lot of them will. Like, I've had a lot more who do rather than don't. I've only really had one or two clients who consistently has no concept of boundaries. And as opposed to, like, and that's one or two clients of like the 80 that I serve. So that are in our program. Does anybody else have a bit of a want to share about how does their lived experience affect how they work?
I can share because I'm really poor at setting boundaries. 1 second. Sorry, yeah. So I had mentioned that I moved from one country to the other, and in the country that I was living in, going to the pool was a big part of the culture. And I, like many other people, despise wearing a bathing suit, but going to the pool, or it's actually, you don't go swimming, you actually go to the hot tub. It's really relaxing. And I went, and a client was there. And it was a male client, and he was staring at me, and I felt so uncomfortable. And so I left, and then I tried to talk to my manager about it, to somehow navigate this, and she's just totally rejected me, and it left such a sour taste in my mouth, and I couldn't go back to the pool, to be honest, after that, because I was always fearful that I would bump into a client. So similar to Nadia's experience. And unfortunately, I didn't have a manager that was understanding as well.
Yeah, and that's why I mentioned too, like, if the manager isn't going to be supportive, or if the supervisor is not going to be supportive, and is not going to listen to your lived experience and accept your boundaries, then it's already kind of doomed, right? So that's like one thing that I mentioned is, not sometimes you'll be in an organization, or you'll be in a job where, like, it's not meant to be, and it's okay to, like, let go of that. I've seen people that have, found jobs within their dream organizations, but the management structure is very toxic, right? And that kind of, like, destroys them from within, and causes a whole bunch of problems. But what holds them back is, like, yeah, but this was the job I wanted, no? And it's like, well, yes, but sometimes what you like, it's not really, your work can't be, especially when you're someone with lived experience, like, you can take your work elsewhere, right? So you should also have an idea of, like, what it is you want to achieve, what are your goals, or what's driving you to kind of carry on in the sector, and you should take that with you wherever you go, because sometimes you end up being very disappointed by the organization that claims to do that work, but for whatever reason actually is not doing that work, or is doing that work in an oppressive way. And it's okay to leave that, or to not be complicit in that oppression, or that violence caused towards your community.
Yeah, that's really wise, actually. That's, yeah, I'm gonna write that down because I forget things, but yeah, thank you. That's
Yeah,
really,
because like, for me, like, I obviously, like, I want to work with queer community members. Like, I love working with queer community members, but the organization that I work at, or the person who writes my checks, they're like, people will be like, I've never even heard of this organization, or people who have heard of the organization is like, what do they know about the queer community? And it's like, well, nothing. But my supervisor is really great. So I can actually achieve things, and I can propose ideas. Like, I'm really empowered here to like start new projects. And I could go to an organization that claims to have a mandate to serve my community, but I might not encounter a management team that actually will empower me in the way that this organization empowers me, even though I spend a lot more time educating folks on like very basic things. I am empowered because they believe when I'm educating them that it's coming from a place of good. And when I'm proposing new ideas, they're trusting me. They're entrusting me to achieve and conquer new frontiers. So or organizations can claim to have whatever mandate they have, it might not be reflective of the reality on the ground. So I have had opportunities to work for 2 other queer organizations during my contract here. I've been here for close to 2 years now. And I've said, no, like, I'm good here. And people were surprised, but I was like, I'm good here because I have control over my boundaries, and I also have control over my work. Anybody else? Nobody has anything to contribute about how their lived experience affects how they work?
I can go. I think for me, it's just touching on something that Nadia and Darlene has shared around boundaries. Like, one thing that I'm still trying to fully understand and like create as like boundaries around needs. I work at CCBT, similar to my colleagues who are joining in the session as well. And I think noticing what need that you have, especially like working with youth, there's a lot of need, the sector, like not just the sector, but the job that we do and what our organization provides. So knowing where you end and other people begin, it's a very tricky. And I think for me, I noticed that when it comes to working outside of work hours, or having a constant like thought about, wait, what happened with this individual? What happened with this case? Like, that's something that constantly runs the back of my mind. So like, I think noticing what is it that I actually need in order to serve someone well, because I notice when I don't know what those needs that I need set up, burnout becomes very easy. So I think that's something that I'm wrestling out, or still trying to fully flesh out, I guess.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. That's so it's in so many, like, I think every person I've ever met who works in the nonprofit sector has been like, I do a lot of work outside my work hours. So that's such a common experience. But it's sometimes the kind of hammer needs to come down, and people need to know not to expect that, maybe treat it like a nice to have. Oh, maybe I'll get an after hours response, but the expectation should never be made that you should do that, or you have to do that. Nobody else? Okay, well, that was actually the end of my presentation. I always like to make sure that it's as discussion focused as possible. So I really do appreciate the folks who contributed. also like for those who didn't contribute, but were just like watching and listening, I also have a lot of appreciation for you folks. And I hope that you took something out of this. I hope that, you know, this could be something that you guys could refer to in the future, or, you know, think about when you encounter one of these moments. And yeah, I'll, I guess, leave my email or something like that if you guys ever want to connect on, you know, supporting queer youth or queer folks in your client list. I can also send resources as soon as I'm able to. So yeah, thank you. And thank you